Welcome to Heartbreak and Hope with Pat Barbarito, the show that explores how to build up or break down any relationship with confidence, clarity, and compassion.
So sustaining a professional life with all of life's demands, it's challenging. And I think during the pandemic, we all experienced challenges. And I think it made us think about our professional lives, our work-life balance. And, with that reflection the last few years, I think it was also a time for a lot of decisions to be made. I know in my own practice as a divorce lawyer, I remember when the pandemic hit, obviously, I was extremely concerned about running my business, my employees, my life. But I thought, okay, well, it's been a good 40 years, But interestingly, about a month, it was quiet for a month or two. And then we were getting calls in our divorce practice, unprecedented volumes of calls. People who hadn't been together that much in their marriages realized they didn't like each other, or people who realized that one or the other person was maybe doing something outside of the marriage that they found out about, or people who realized they weren't happy. So it was shocking to me how this all unfolded. And lawyers professionally were challenged in ways that they hadn't been challenged before. They had to work from home. They had family obligations, or they were alone working from home and they were isolated. But it became a very different time in the practice of law. It was bizarre. Now, I do have to say, now that I look back, Zoom, less court appearances, more remote work has been a positive thing. But during that time, I have known many lawyers who really questioned their professional existence and thought, what am I doing? When we talk about lawyers and a sustainable life, I sort of sometimes say to myself, oh, come on, boo-hoo. I mean, there are people who are first responders and people who are on the front lines. And I think, oh, gosh, I mean, who wants to hear about a bunch of lawyers whining about their profession? It's kind of hard to feel sorry for us. And a lot of people, well, we're not their favorite people. So when I came across Traci Cipriano and her work, The Thriving Lawyer, a multidimensional model of well-being for a sustainable legal profession, it got my attention, again, especially after the last few years. Recently, I was with a close friend of mine, about my age, practicing about the same amount of time. She manages her firm, and we started talking about how we identify, because as you approach a certain age, you think about the next chapters. I said, I'm a lawyer. And she said the same thing. And I was thinking a lot about that. It's who we are. So somebody says, who are you? I don't say a mother, a daughter. I say, I'm a lawyer. That caused me to reflect back to about 15 years ago when my marriage was crumbling and ending. I got myself some very good therapy. And when I walked in, the therapist said, well, tell me about yourself. And I said, I'm a lawyer. He said, well, what else are you? Well, I have kids. I'm a parent. I'm a lawyer. And it took about 3 months for me to change that answer, because it's really how we identify. So in any event, we're going to talk a lot about that today. With me today is Traci. And Traci Cipriano is an author. She's a clinical psychologist and a former practicing attorney. She's used her education, training, research, and experience to address and promote lawyer well-being. In addition to her independent practice, she's also an associate clinical professor at the Yale School of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry, Law and Psychiatry Division, and a former consulting clinical supervisor in the Yale Psychology Department. Welcome, Traci.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
We're happy you are. So before we dive in, Traci, I know you began your career as an attorney and then you transitioned into the medical field. And if you could talk to us about that journey, we'd be interested in hearing about that.
Well, I'll start with undergrad. I was a psychology major, but I was also interested in law and policy issues. And when it came time to graduate and think about the next step, I thought, I could probably do more to promote change in the world as a lawyer. And so I went to law school, and I found that there were a lot of things I liked about law, the problem solving and research writing and working with people. But there were things that I didn't like about the day-to-day practice. In terms of my personality, I've just found the constant adversarial nature of the profession to be draining. And I was thinking about starting a family, and I was thinking, how is this all going to work in the workplace? I ended up returning to graduate school for my doctorate in clinical psychology. And I think an important time when I thought about making that change, I was doing volunteer work in a shelter for victims of domestic violence. And I was giving them education on how they could file their own court documents or refer them to pro bono attorneys. And I found that these women really wanted to just share their story. And I wanted to help them on a psychological level. And I couldn't. I didn't have the training yet. And it was at that time that I thought, maybe my skills and interests would be better served in a different role or profession.
That's interesting to me. You say the adversarial nature of the practice. But isn't that what being a lawyer is? I understand there's all kinds of law. There are transactional lawyers. There's all kinds of practice of law that aren't necessarily as adversarial as some other practices. But implicit in being a trial lawyer, for example, you're an adversary. So that's just part of the practice, isn't it? I was trying a case many, many years ago, and the judge said to me, she gave me a big talk, a kumbaya talk, I'd say. And I said, I'm not an MSW. I'm a lawyer. I'm an advocate. I mean, isn't that who we are?
I have a couple of responses to that. One is, yes, there is an adversarial piece, and some people really, thrive on that. They enjoy that piece and get charged up to go into court and do that. I am not one of them. There's also the question of, does that begin to permeate your life and your relationships? Does it permeate your work environment? How do people treat each other at work? Can you turn that off when you go home? What are your interactions like with your partner and your children and your friends? It's being able to shift between those roles that can be difficult. And if we're not even tuned into that that's an issue, we can't, we can't change the problem.
You hit on something that's very interesting. The adversarial nature of what we do, does it permeate our personal lives? And listen, how often do we hear lawyer friends or colleagues and their spouses saying, don't cross-examine me. I'm not on the witness stand.
Right.
Maybe my former husband, maybe once or twice said to me, this isn't the courtroom. I'm not admitting anything, but maybe.
Sure.
So is there a way, because we're lawyers, it's our DNA, is there a way to be an adversary and advocate and separate it, compartmentalize it? Do you think that's possible? Or do you think by virtue of being an advocate and an adversary, the boundaries are just not there? Are there ways to separate it?
That's another great question. And it absolutely is possible. If I didn't believe it was possible, I wouldn't be doing the work I'm doing.
Or you wouldn't have written your book.
Right, right. I think you need to be aware of your internal experiences and how you're feeling. And it's a degree of emotional intelligence. How are you thinking? How are you feeling? How are you relating to people? Are you attuned to what the people you're talking to are experiencing? So that involves self-reflection. And as lawyers, we're not trained to reflect on our internal experience. It's all about an external focus and how we come across to others. And are we appearing competent and strong and in control of the situation?
I've often said when I interview people for our firm and people join us, I'd much rather hire somebody who has a high degree of emotional intelligence. Certainly, people have to be bright and capable, but emotional intelligence matters. Has your experience been that most lawyers have a high degree of emotional intelligence? Because that has not been my experience in many areas, and in many areas it is. Divorce lawyers, I must say, I believe, maybe it's my prejudice, many times do have a high level of emotional intelligence. It's what distinguishes us. What is your experience about that?
I agree that a lot of divorce lawyers do appear to have high levels of emotional intelligence, and it's a very relational aspect of the law. You need to be able to read and appreciate your clients and respond to them appropriately and understand how the stresses of what you're experiencing in working with certain clients is how that's impacting you and managing it. And that's the piece that maybe is a little more challenging for people. But you're right. I think there are varying levels of emotional intelligence. And that's not just the legal profession, but certainly, yes, across practice areas there are.
So in your book, you speak about the honeycomb model of well-being. And in fact, I noticed that you dedicate the book to your daughter, saying, may their lives reflect a full honeycomb of well-being. It's a great expression. Tell us what you mean by that.
So when we think about well-being, it goes far beyond self-care. Self-care is an important piece, and that's what everyone thinks about when we think about well-being. But when I talk about well-being, I like to say, start with, well, why? Why do we care about well-being? How does stress impact us in terms of our performance, in terms of our emotional state, in terms of our physical health? How does it impact you as a lawyer in terms of your work product and professional liability issues? And what are the costs of stress in terms of your health and medical costs and things like that? Once we understand why we should care, then, well, what do we do about it? And self-care is a big piece of it, but there are many other factors that influence your well-being, such as your relationships. Do you make time for the important people in your lives? Do you make time to create strong relationships with people in your life? Social support is essential, and people can die of loneliness. If we don't have enough close relationships in our lives, it's very problematic. Do we have a sense of meaning and purpose in our lives? And you may derive that from your work. You may be doing something that makes you feel good, like you're making a contribution. And it may be the subject matter of your work, but it could also just be being a part of a team and part of an organization or a firm that you feel like reflects your goals and values and what you want to do and gives you a place to grow and learn as an attorney and feel like you're a big contributor to the process. There are issues of financial stress. I mean, many law students graduate with a lot of debt. And then what do we do about that if they're not making a salary that lets them, pay for rent and pay for their loans? That can create a lot of stress, which, in addition to learning as they're, beginning to practice, is different than law school. What kind of stress does that put on them? There's, again, that external focus in the profession on appearing successful. And sometimes people make poor financial decisions in an effort to appear successful. And then so this creates a lot of additional stress. So that is a piece of the well-being. Your work-life balance challenges. Many women certainly experience this, but more and more men are expressing an interest in being a part of their family life. So there are a lot of different factors. And then the workplace, and I won't get into that, but how does your workplace run and operate? What are your demands? How do people treat each other? All of these things create some sort of stress, and that stress impacts you. Understanding what all of these different factors are and how to manage them. I see it as a way of being. It's kind of a lens, appreciating all the aspects of your life that influence you, and how do you manage them in a way that you can maintain optimal physical health, psychological health, manage your stress, and be performing at your best.
So when you say honeycomb, I have this sort of visual. So is it that each box or shape is filled with something? Is that your vision? Tell me what you mean by that.
Yes. So I see each of these factors is interrelated. So they're separate, but they're all interrelated. So yes, you have your self-care piece, and that's related to each of these aspects of your life, the stress arising out of them. You have your work environment. Your work environment creates stress, and how do you manage that stress? So yes, there are several different elements in the honeycomb, such as attention to your physical and emotional health, your self-care, your meaning and purpose in life, your financial situation, your social supports, work-life balance, and how can you create change in these areas.
So, again, these are just my sort of observations in doing this over 40 years. I think that lawyers are unique in that appearance is really important to them. I don't know if that applies to other professions. I'll ask you about that. But, the thing about lawyers, we are about appearances. I mean, we are prideful people. And I wonder, is that something else, or is that something that transcends other professions? And B, what is it about lawyers that makes us so darn concerned about how everybody else looks at us?
Another great question. It certainly isn't a unique to the legal profession, but lawyers are, high achieving professionals. They're perfectionists, many of them. And so they have high standards for themselves and how they appear, and they have high standards for others around them. And they want to appear in control and like they are on the top of their game, and they know the law, they know how to handle the situation. And when you go to law school really fosters that
How?
focus on appearing competent, being able to have the answers on at the drop of a hat, not appearing weak. You're not taught to think about what your internal experience is. You learn that emotions can represent weakness. They can influence your decision making. You learn very quickly that you can't put emotion into the equation when thinking about a case in front of you. It has to be based on logic and reason and precedent. That I would argue is done in a way that people learn to just suppress their emotion. But emotion actually is adaptive, and you can actually have a richer experience. If you can appreciate what your emotions are telling you, you can learn from them and do more. That goes into the emotional intelligence piece instead of just completely ignoring them. But if people don't know what to do with them, they're more likely to ignore them because that's the safest way to go.
Lawyers, I think, are also a little unique. And again, I suppose there are other professions like this, but we all know each other. I mean, it's unbelievable. The 6 degrees. Everybody knows everybody who knows everybody, and we all know about each other's lives and personal lives. I wonder if part of that is, particularly in private practice, if you have underlying issues that aren't strong or aren't successful, whatever that means, do people hire you? I mean, would you hire somebody whose life is completely screwed up? I don't know. We don't know that about our doctors. We don't know that about other professionals. But when you hear it about a lawyer, it goes through the legal community like wildfire, and it's uncomfortable. I have told the story before on the podcast that when my own marriage was ending about 13, 15 years ago, I think one of the hardest things for me was that people would find out that I didn't have a Christmas card life, I call it. I was so invested in that Christmas card. I look back and I think, who cared? But it was really important to me. Not proud of that, by the way. This idea that we have to have a certain appearance, physical, emotional, family-wise. It is interesting to me and curious. So give me some psychological input as to, was it just my own ego? Possible. But I think this is something that applies to most lawyers.
I think you're right. I think there's, like you said, you're out there, you're trying to sell yourself and your work, and you want to appear competent and that you don't have any issues. I think there's a big piece of stigma in the legal profession. There's an assumption that any sort of mental health issue represents weakness and a lack of competence. In reality, everyone is on a mental health continuum, just like your physical health, and we all have ups and downs, and it's important to be attuned to. Am I feeling drained? Am I feeling more irritable? What is it about this case that I'm working on that's making me feel this way? Or what about my schedule is not giving me the downtime that I need for sleep, for exercise, for connecting with others? But the inability to even reflect on that because of the fear of stigma creates a problem, because if you do not address something early on, like any physical health issue, it can snowball into something much bigger where you may be experiencing extreme depression or anxiety or start turning to substances to self-medicate. And, in the worst case scenario, we hear of lawyers, death by suicide, which is,
Well, that's a good question. Is there a higher rate of alcoholism, drug addiction, and suicide in the legal profession versus other professions?
Yes, law has much higher rates of depression and anxiety. You see that on survey after survey. There's a lot of substance use. And when we look at least CDC data, the legal profession is high in terms of suicide rates within the profession.
So is that because people with mental health professions are drawn to the law, or the law caused, like, what came first? I mean, there is something about somebody who's drawn to this profession, or does it cause it? How does that work psychologically?
Well, law is a stressful profession. And when you think of you're a perfectionist, you always want to do things perfectly. You want everything to look great all the time. When that doesn't happen, because it doesn't always happen, or you have something that you perceive as an extreme failure, lawyers will have something not go perfectly and feel immense shame, even though people around them may not see it the same way. They feel intense shame. They feel like they've failed. Part of that is that, everyone knows everything about everyone, and it's hard to face their peers. And if because of the stigma around mental health, they don't feel comfortable getting the help that they need. They don't feel comfortable speaking to a therapist, talking to people about what they're experiencing. And sometimes they feel the only way out is to leave.
I'm thinking of physicians and lawyers. So I think as lawyers, we feel shame and we have a loss because we feel I could have done something different. As opposed to the medical field, there's certain outcomes that one can't control. And I think physicians, although they feel things deeply,
They actually
probably
sometimes suicide
they
rate
do
as
too. Well,
well.
there you go.
Yeah.
We're all control freaks, right? But lawyers, I mean, I do. I mean, there have been times in my career, obviously, where decisions didn't come out the way I wanted them to, and I could say, and I see it in my practice here. It's you suffer. I could have done. I should have done. I thought of. I should have thought of this, and it's extremely painful. But
Yes.
you know, again, it almost seems self-indulgent to be even having this conversation candidly. I think it's an important
How
conversation.
so? How so?
Well, because I feel like, again, we are in a privileged profession, right? We're not digging ditches, I always say. I work really hard, but I'm not out in the blazing heat. Most lawyers make a decent living. They could certainly have a roof over the head, put food on the table. So I think it's necessary work. Don't misunderstand me, because I think lawyers as a group need to have the curtain pulled back. And I think your book does that. But it does seem a little bit, self-indulgent to be able to take the time and think about these things when there are people struggling, working hard in other areas that just don't have this luxury. Does that make sense?
Sure, but thinking about things in terms of what the conversation we just had, or more broadly, what?
I think just more broadly. I think more
Yeah.
broadly that the fact that we could sit here and have this conversation, and you with your background have taken the time to delve into this and write a book that's necessary, it's privilege. It's a privilege that we have. You don't look at it like that.
I don't. I think it's important. Our society with technology is here to help us. It's supposed to make our work easier, but instead it's compounded our work. We're constantly available. We have to be on all these different platforms. We have to understand and learn all the changing technology to be up to date. It creates a whole new level of burden. And maybe that'll be a chapter in my next book about how technology.
Oh, that's a great topic.
Yes. And so we get busier and busier, and we have more and more forces pulling at our time and our attention. And it's very important to be able to create a boundary and say, okay, when do I take care of myself? It's easy to, probably the one thing we have complete control over is our self-care. And so when we have obligations to everyone else and our work and people in our lives, the thing we can put on hold is our self-care. Well, I'll get to that eventually. I need to meet all these other responsibilities. And we need to shift our thinking to say, I need to take care of myself first so that I can do a better job at work, so I can be a better parent, a better partner, whatever it is. Because if you don't take care of yourself, how you relate to your world is not going to be optimal and could become problematic.
Do you think that, I almost feel like we're sort of going, and at some point there's going to be a big reset button with regard to technology because it's out of control. I always say, when I started, again, it was a long time ago, there were no fax machines. There were not even voicemail. There were certainly not computers 40 something years ago. And it is overwhelming now. And don't you feel we're just running. And someday we're just going to say, stop and start over. I almost think we're getting to that point because young people are burning out. They're frustrated. They're overwhelmed.
Right. And so what can we do about it? And I don't have to use your word, a Pollyanna view that we are going to change everything all at once. The idea about the book is to look at a certain chapter, a certain area. What is most relevant to you? And what is most relevant to your workplace? Where are you struggling the most? And start there and start small. Make one small change. Once you make one change, it feels good and it's reinforcing, and then it's easier to move on from there. But we're not going to change everything tomorrow.
So I want to talk to you about solutions in a little while, but you mentioned something before that I want to hit upon, which is loneliness. I believe loneliness has been recognized as an epidemic, a serious health issue. And you mentioned loneliness in the context of lawyers and isolation. Can you talk to us about that?
Sure. Many lawyers are experiencing loneliness. Actually, Law 360 asked me to write an article on lawyer loneliness. And it has to do with the profession. There are just the time demands. People don't feel like they have time to focus on relationships. And there's burnout that you mentioned that's rampant in the profession. So part of that burnout experience is exhaustion. You get home at the end of the day and you're mentally and physically and emotionally exhausted. And it's hard to now sit and listen to your partner or your children or your friend talk about what's going on in their day because you're just feeling, oh, I just want to check out. So there's that piece of being overwhelmed in terms of your work. And then there are those interactional pieces that spill over into your personal life. Are you cross-examining people? Is someone talking to you about a problem and you're going, hey, wait, but did you do this? Did you do that? What about this? And they're going, can you just hear me? And that this is what I'm experiencing. So there are a few different things in a lawyer's life that can impair your ability to build strong and healthy relationships or to focus on them.
So I want to switch our focus a little bit to a lot of what you talk about in the book, cultivating meaning and purpose solutions, because I don't think there's any question that lawyer mental health and well-being is a real issue. And when it ends up resulting in situations of alcoholism or drug abuse or, heaven forbid, suicide, it's extreme. But you address ways to continue to practice law, whatever area you're in, and have personal relationships, develop social support, and cultivate meaning and purpose. So I'd like to talk about that. Let's start with personal relationship and social supports. What are your suggestions in your book, The Thriving Lawyer, as to how to develop those, maintain those, and build those relationships and social support?
I think you have to start with yourself and reflect on who you are, what are your beliefs, what are your values, what are your interests, and begin to connect with people who have similar values, beliefs, and interests. You start small. Start by having conversations, by having conversations with people in your life, in your workplace, having small talk instead of just going through the day, task oriented. Start by having what's going on? How was your day? Having a superficial conversation, let's say, that feels inefficient to lawyers, but those superficial conversations are important. That's a starting point for building a connection, and you can build on those things over time. Being able to listen to what someone's actually saying to you and said, okay, if you say, how's it going? And they actually tell you something relevant, listen to it and respond to it. Some lawyers are afraid to ask, how's it going? Because they don't want to hear for real what's going on. They're too busy. But you need to carve out times in your life where you're going to say, okay, can we pause for a minute?
Yeah. So you mentioned a word, inefficient. And
yeah,
boy, does that describe lawyers. We are always trying to maximize efficiency. And I don't think maximizing efficiency is always efficient.
Right. So relationships are not efficient and structured. They're very loose, and there's that emotional component that is so important. And you may have a conversation that doesn't feel like it's going to a certain particular end, but just by virtue of having that conversation, you are building a relationship with the person that you're talking to. You are building an experience that you can build on, that you can expand on later. One of the things people don't like about virtual work is you're not around other people in your work environment. You feel isolated because, and not everyone, but some people need others around them. And it's that interaction. And you realize once you are back into an in-person setting, gosh, I really miss this. I think everyone experienced that when you're around a group of people. I was just at a conference last week, and it's like, wow, this is so nice to be around all of these people and have these conversations. And you each time you meet up with certain people in your environment, you can expand on the relationship you started to build during your previous interaction.
So along those lines, you talk about environment. I think I've always maintained, certainly, sometimes young lawyers jump from job to job. It's not uncommon. I started here when I was 23 in law school. I'm going to be 67, so 43 years later. But there's a reason I stayed here. One, I wanted to build a business, but I think as importantly is we started with and have continued, and I'm proud of this, a culture so that when we come, I would say when we come into this building, I do feel support. I do feel that we support each other. It's not a naive approach. I think it's real. So to me, when I see lawyers jumping around for, a few more dollars, I don't minimize economics.
Yeah.
I say you got to understand, grass isn't always greener. It sounds like a cliche, but culture matters. I don't know if you can understand that as a younger person or a newer lawyer, but it matters.
In terms of building relationships, the piece lawyers struggle with is vulnerability and sharing something about yourself that isn't part of that persona that you put on and that you put on for the world, that inner piece that may not feel safe to share. It is that piece that helps build intimacy. If we cannot be vulnerable with people, we cannot create intimacy. And intimacy is what helps us to feel connected and to not feel lonely.
So vulnerability, I think, is a huge issue with lawyers and their egos. So it's funny, our healthy egos often make us good lawyers. Our healthy egos often make us not vulnerable. And not being vulnerable makes it difficult to connect with people. So it's a vicious circle. I will tell you that having sort of grown up professionally here, I was able to be vulnerable because I've been here my whole career. But in my professional life, but personally, I had a very hard time doing that. I've shared this story before that when I did pull back the curtain and say, my marriage is difficult. I'm in a difficult situation. I'm in a lot of pain. I always say I think I was a pretty darn good divorce lawyer before that. I became a much better one because I spoke with confidence, with humility, and it wasn't such a bad thing. I didn't like it at first. I hated it. I was never angry about my marriage ending. I was angry about people knowing my marriage wasn't good.
How did being a divorce lawyer make that more difficult?
Much more difficult because when people come to me, I thought, they don't want to have, nobody you don't want to go to a doctor who's sick, right? You don't want to go to a lawyer who's going through things. I'm supposed to be the relationship expert. I'm supposed to understand this. Surprise. It made it very difficult. And it also made it very painful because I was listening to stories every day and you can't help but reflect upon your own. Having said that, pulling back that curtain was by far the healthiest thing I've ever done. And I became renewed and re-energized. And although I don't often share my personal story with clients one-on-one, I do on this podcast, I think it made me more relatable. Got off my high horse a little bit, My Christmas card, it wasn't so perfect. And that was okay.
And your clients understood she gets it.
She gets it. And of course, I got it in a way that maybe before I didn't.
Yeah.
And it also took away a lot of the pain. So, anybody listening, I say, look, you handle it appropriately. You don't boo-hoo to your clients, but you take this experience and you show vulnerability. And I do think it helped. I do. I think it helped me be more relatable. I think it helped me be more human. I think it helped my people understood my story a little bit better. So I would encourage people, lawyers, and I'm an adversary, I'm a trial lawyer, that it's a good thing to be vulnerable. It's a good thing to say, I need to hit the pause button. It's okay.
It made you
hard
as a lawyer. It's very hard, but it actually takes strength to put it out there, and it made you better. You were able to deal with it and to move on instead of having this inner burden of trying to hide it, which is a strength. Stuffing. And I did feel like I would come here and work. Yeah. So I think that when you talk about the psychology of being a lawyer, it's sort of counterintuitive to be open and vulnerable. Yes.
But ironically, it makes us better lawyers, right?
Exactly.
So tell our audience how they could start being vulnerable without being inappropriate professionally.
Sure. Again, I go back to this all the time. You need to understand yourself and what you're experiencing, because you can't share it with others unless you fully understand it yourself. And then start small. Just, yeah, I'm having a tough day. Yeah, I'm having some challenges at home. Just give me a moment, or just ask for what you need. You don't have to go into detail. There will be people who are interested and want to support you, people who care about you, and they may ask you about it later. What's going on? And you can share a little bit. Oh, my marriage isn't doing so well right now, and I'm trying to figure things out. Thanks for asking. And just by sharing that nugget, you're bringing that person into your world and letting them know that you trust them and you're willing to build a deeper relationship with them. Trust is a big piece. And when you're in an adversarial profession, you're afraid to share too much because you don't want people to use it against you later.
Do you think that's something that lawyers are guilty of, sort of trying to get an edge? And I do. I think that happens, unfortunately.
Sure. And so it involves knowing who you can share with and when, and starting small.
The loneliness piece, I want to get back to that a minute, because especially during the pandemic, ironically, people who had families, although sometimes their marriage ended, they weren't lonely. But a lot of people who lived alone, younger people or older people, I saw the impact interacting with people, that they were sort of, a little out there sometimes. I every day got up, got dressed, not as nicely, but I forced myself to do that. And I was fortunate. My daughter was home with me from college for a while, but you had to really work hard on not being lonely during that period of time. And I think it damaged a lot of people. I think they never quite came back. Did you see that?
I think people have struggled. I don't know if I'd say people are damaged, but it was difficult. And I'd say probably the people who went into the pandemic with the strongest relationships had an easier time maintaining them. If your relationships were more superficial, just involved the people around you, high, and not a deeper connection, it's hard to reach out to them now when you're virtual and have a meaningful conversation. So it was important to build those relationships before the pandemic. So
it took work.
Yeah, all of this takes work. And, you can be surrounded by lots of people and still feel lonely if you're not connected, if you're not feeling connected, if you don't have that intimacy piece. Or you could have, be working from home and not feel lonely because you've built strong relationships and there are people you can count on. There are people you'll get together with in the evening or on the weekends. And so you don't feel lonely, even though you may be alone while working remotely.
You write about cultivating meaning and purpose. How is that different than building personal and social relationships?
Meaning and purpose really goes into your values, your beliefs. What is important to you in life? How do you want to make a connection? How do you want to make a contribution to the world? What makes you feel good? Some people develop meaning and purpose just from growing as a lawyer. Are you in a job that allows you to learn and grow and develop and feel like you're contributing to something bigger? Some people, it's more contributing to the greater good. Or what are you doing to help the world be a better place? It's different for everyone, but it's, again, understanding what is that for you and how do you meet that value?
So if you were sitting here lecturing, first-year lawyers, which I know you worked with lawyers all the time, what would you give them as a roadmap so as to have a successful, whatever their definition of success is, profession, but yet maintain well-being? How would you tell them to approach that?
It's funny. I'm working on this. I'm actually doing some law school orientation presentations.
Oh, wow. Did not know that.
And I'm thinking about how to convey this, because I think it's important to start right now as you're going into law school. Yes, you need to learn the law. You need how to be a good advocate, but you also need to learn how to take care of yourself in the process. And so I think it's important to be attuned to these issues from day one. Now you're going to be busy. You're going to be buried in the books. You don't just ignore your relationships, ignore your friends, ignore your self-care because you've got exams at the end of the semester. It's important to make this be a lifestyle, a way of being, and to be deliberate in terms of taking care of yourself, understanding who you are as a person, what your values are, recognizing who the important people in your world are. You may not be able to maintain strong relationships with 50 people, but there must be a core group of people that you want to maintain those relationships with. And what are you going to do to make sure when you're busy in law school and work, how are you going to maintain those connections. Even a text, it's kind of silly, but even sending a text to someone, how's it going? Thinking about you today. Looking forward to seeing you this weekend. Here's an article. Check this out. Just things like that can help you stay connected to people, as long as there's more to the relationship than the text. But those texts during times when you're busy can help people know, you're still important to me. I'm still thinking of you, and I'll see you this weekend or next weekend or whenever that's going to be.
So I don't know now. I know when I went to law school in the late 70s, there were no courses about well-being, mental health, thriving. I can't even imagine. Has that changed? Do you see that changing, that culture changing from a professorial point of view, teaching young people in any profession about well-being? Because that was not on the radar. I remember my first day of law school, a professor, I remember this so clearly. It was contracts class. And there were like maybe 15, 20% of women then, it was the 70s. And I remember a professor saying, how many of you were married or in a relationship in this room? Well, I certainly wasn't. And people raised their hand. He goes, yeah, the chances are you're not going to be in that in 3 years.
Right.
I was like, oh my gosh. So, and that was the only conversation we ever had about relationships. So do you see that landscape changing in the academic world in any profession?
I do. It is changing. Certainly in medical school and in law school. Some law schools more than others. Like, for instance, one law school wants me to speak at orientation, and they're sharing their book, and they bought a number of books for their students. Another law school, I believe, is going to be buying books for all of their students, and they want to integrate it into one of their first year classes and have wellness be a part of each class.
It's unheard of. I mean, I can't even imagine it. That's great.
Yes, it's wonderful. And so they'll introduce it in orientation, and then I'll go back mid-year and talk about how's it going. I'll help them think about developing a wellness plan and ask them to talk about how that is going. So different schools are doing different things, but it is changing. It is changing. And I think integrating it is important. So I will, I'll speak to a law school, maybe one during the semester. Here's my talk. But I think actually integrating it into your curriculum, having your faculty appreciate the value of it is the way to go.
I'm fascinated. And I think it's interesting that law schools and hopefully other professional schools are beginning to be conscious of wellness beyond their specific professional training. However, there are some generations, older generations, that might say, oh, come on, we're creating a soft generation and we're indulging these young people and, buck up. You got to admit, we hear that, don't we? Because as these young people are entering, there are 2 or 3 generations above them. People are working longer. So you have a 25-year-old entering, working with an almost 70-year-old, and they're saying, oh, please, buck up, and you're getting soft. All this catering and all this, trophy for every time you do something, worrying about your feelings. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that and how it is addressing the more senior generations necessary in educating them, because many of them, I'm not saying me, do struggle a little bit with this indulgence, candidly. I hear it a lot.
Well, one thing people say to me often is, we just have to wait for the older generation to die off. And
that's exciting. Wow.
I want to be that person that people.
It was nobody in my office. Nobody in my office said that to you, did they?
No. Nope, not in your office. You want to be that person.
But that's a great thing. That's funny.
Yeah, and it's true. People feel like they can't change them. And so we'll just have to wait for them to die off. But I think maybe getting to what motivates them. Bottom line, how is this going to help the firm financially? What are your insurance costs? How many people are getting care for, cardiac issues, back pain, neck pain, depression? And what are these doing to your costs as a firm? How many people are, sick, sometimes dying from heart attack, stroke, what have you? These may be top performers, but if they're going to leave you at 45 or 50 or 55, and what if that's you? Do you want to be that person? looking at research on burnout and how it affects productivity and performance, looking at research on emotional intelligence and psychological safety. Psychological safety is a scary term for lawyers.
What does that mean? I don't even know what that means.
It means that you feel comfortable in your work environment to take interpersonal risks. And so you are able to ask questions. You're able to say, I don't have the answer to that, but let me look. That you are willing to ask for constructive feedback. And it's a safe place to learn and grow. You're willing to admit you made a mistake. I mean, how many people are afraid to admit they made a mistake and then it becomes a bigger problem? Or you're aware that there's a mistake that's gone on at some level, but you're afraid to be the one to point it out because, then everything will come out on you. People will be angry at you for pointing out the mistake, where you want to value people for saying, hey, that could have been done a little differently. What do you think? There may not be the big financial costs of a mistake if people are willing to say early on, I think that's a mistake there. I think we need to fix it. Think about that lawyer case with the ChatGPT and all the fake. What if an associate or someone else saw that and said, I think there's something wrong there. I think you don't want to file that. Maybe they were afraid to say something. I don't know.
So do you think that the more senior generations have to die off? Or do you think that gradually they may understand a different way of doing things?
If they see how it'll benefit their firm, then they can, there needs to be something in it for them, probably financial, to see how it'll help performance, how it'll help talent. People stay at the firm instead of leaving. There are firms that just people turn over, and there's a cost in retraining people. Is that something that, do they see a value in keeping people at the firm and not having to go through that process? Do they see a value in having people that bring their best every day instead of always being, exhausted?
So let me ask it a little bit differently and look at it a little differently. I hate to say in the old days, but before there was email and, voicemail and cell phones and things, people would work in the office many times these larger firms to these bizarre hours, right? And I think clearly we've gotten away from that mindset, I hope. But even in medium-sized practices, I mean, we worked long hours. You came in every Saturday. The reality, however, was there is a certain economic reward that comes from that. So if you're working and billing 10 hours a day, as opposed to 7 hours a day, there's a different economic reward. And I think sometimes, and I know this is not exactly politically correct to talk about, some of the frustration is it's okay to have a culture of well-being. I think it's necessary. I think stress is killing us off, but the economics are impacted. And I think people have to be realistic about the economic consequences, older and younger. And I'm not so sure people are in any profession.
I'm not going to tell firms how to run their firms. And I think the market will eventually determine where people work. If some firms start to change how they operate, then maybe all the talent will go there. And I'm not here to share that. But even if you are working 6 days a week, are you also available by text and email, like all hours of the night when you're home? Or are you able to actually sleep? Are you able to have, some time in your evening to do what you need to do to connect with people, to get some exercise, to do some yoga, to read, whatever you want to do, and they get a reasonable amount of sleep so you can come in the next day and do your work?
I do have to say, again, that's another post-pandemic benefit, if there's such a thing. I think that if you would have told me 5 years ago that lawyers could work from home and they'll clock out at 5 but reconnect at 8, or they'll have these bizarro hours, I would have said that will never work. We need to be on the floor. Right. It's great. Yeah. It's efficient. People are working when they can work. They're focusing when they can focus. And I think it's a model that works. It did take some mental adjustment. And I see that for a lot of people at my senior level, but it's working. So I think that we could probably educate the senior people in terms of different ways to work smarter. Yeah. It's not working less.
It's working smarter and being at your best when you are at work. I mean, you could say it's working less if you're saying, I'm going to create a boundary at home that after a certain hour, I do not have to respond to emails, texts, what have you. But overall, I guess there's there is some sacrifice there. And some firms may just want to burn you out and then bring in the next person.
Or they may say, this is who this person is. Let's manage this person with their skill set and their needs as they need to be managed so we can optimize their productivity and their mental health.
That's the ideal way. Yes, that's
Yeah.
exactly it. And taking a more individualized approach, which puts a burden on supervisors who are managing them. But I think that is ultimately the best option. There isn't a one size fits all for everyone. And being able to do that, I think, is key.
As a co-managing partner of a firm, I think that's the challenge. And we do work on that all the time, taking the individual situation and optimizing it. It's not easy and it's a challenge. And I don't by any means think we've perfected the skill, but I do think that's the way to go. And I think that your book, The Thriving Lawyer, will help people understand that they can have a sustainable life. They can take care of themselves, be practicing attorneys, know who they are, know their boundaries, know their strengths, which is another part of well-being. Every lawyer doesn't have to be cross-examining people. Every lawyer doesn't have to be writing contracts. There are so many ways to practice law. I think that one of the things we could do for young people in general, any profession, is know who you are and evolve consistent with who you are. I always like to say that if you ask me the best thing a parent could do, I'd like to think, I hope my children agree with me, I knew who they were. They're not lawyers, by the way, but I knew who my kids were. And if you know who people are and you work on their strengths, I think that they could have a successful life, certainly a successful legal profession. I would encourage anybody in the legal profession, and maybe not, to read your book, The Thriving Lawyer, and be conscious of well-being and having a sustainable profession. And I thank you for taking the time to be with us. This is good reading, a little different, a little out of the box, but I think it's helpful. So thank you.
It's been great speaking with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast platform. Please give us a 5-star rating and leave a review so more people can listen in to Heartbreak and Hope with Pat Barbarito.